The small-town diner was alive with the hum of morning chatter, the clinking of coffee mugs, and the warm smell of bacon sizzling on the griddle. Outside, a light drizzle pattered against the window, casting streaks across the glass as regulars trickled in for their breakfast. In the far corner, at a booth near the window, sat Walt Jennings, 81 years old, a Vietnam War veteran, and a man who wore his age with quiet dignity. His faded olive-green jacket, adorned with patches from his military service, hung neatly on the back of his chair. Walt was no stranger to the diner. For the past decade, he'd shown up at 7 a.m. sharp, ordered black coffee and 2 eggs over easy, and read the paper while chatting with anyone who came by. That morning, though, the air felt a little different. A group of bikers had rolled into town earlier, their engines rumbling through Main Street like distant thunder. They were loud, leather-clad, and clearly unfamiliar faces in this otherwise quiet community. Most folks ignored them, but there was a certain tension as they strutted inside the diner, boots heavy on the tiled floor. 3 of them took seats at the counter, while one, a tall man with a beard and a scar running down his cheek, decided to stand near Walt's booth. He glanced at the veteran's jacket hanging on the chair, then at Walt himself, who was calmly buttering his toast. The biker smirked, clearly sizing him up. "Nice jacket, old man," the biker said, his tone dripping with sarcasm. Walt looked up over his glasses, offered a polite nod, and replied, "Thank you. Served in Nam. Been with me a long time." The biker scoffed. "Yeah, bet you just wear it for the attention. You think people still care about that?" His voice was loud enough to draw stares from other patrons. Walt's hand stilled on his coffee cup, but his voice remained calm. "Son, I don't wear it for attention. I wear it because it's a part of me." The biker leaned closer, his breath carrying the sharp smell of cheap whiskey. "Part of you, huh? Let me guess. You think you're some kind of hero." At this point, a couple of the diner's regulars shifted uncomfortably in their seats. The waitress, Carol, tried to defuse the situation. "Sir, why don't you take a seat and I'll get you some coffee?" she suggested, stepping between them. But the biker ignored her. Then, in a sudden, unprovoked burst, the biker's hand whipped across Walt's face. The sharp smack echoed through the diner, followed by a collective gasp. Walt's head jerked to the side, his glasses clattering onto the table. He didn't retaliate, didn't even raise his voice. He simply took a deep breath, straightened himself, and reached for his napkin to dab at the corner of his mouth where a small cut had appeared. "You shouldn't have done that," Walt said quietly, his tone calm but edged with something cold. Carol immediately stepped in, her voice trembling with outrage. "Get out, right now," she demanded, but the biker just laughed and sauntered back toward his friends at the counter. Several customers pulled out their phones, some calling the police, others recording the scene. Walt, however, did something unexpected. He reached into his pocket, pulled out an old flip phone, and made a short call. His words were simple. "It's Dad. I'm at the diner. I need you here." He hung up without further explanation. The minutes that followed were tense. The biker gang laughed among themselves, occasionally glancing toward Walt like a predator checking if its prey was still breathing. Walt, unfazed, returned to sipping his coffee, his hand steady, his gaze fixed out the rain-streaked window. Every so often, he'd glance at the clock on the wall, as if counting down. By the 10th minute, the first police car pulled up outside. 2 officers entered, asking questions and trying to keep things under control. But before they could remove the troublemakers, the sound of engines filled the street again, this time, not from loud choppers but from a convoy of military vehicles. Outside, a black SUV came to a halt, followed by 2 olive-drab Humvees. The diner's front door swung open with a metallic chime, and in stepped a tall man in full Army combat uniform. His presence commanded immediate attention, his posture straight, his expression sharp. The name patch on his chest read Jennings. The man scanned the room until his eyes landed on Walt. "Dad," he said, his voice carrying both relief and restrained fury. Walt smiled faintly. "You made good time, son." Behind him, more soldiers entered, armed, disciplined, and clearly ready to act. The biker gang froze, their earlier bravado evaporating in an instant. The soldier, Walt's son, turned his gaze toward the scar-faced biker who delivered the slap. Which one? He asked his father. Walt didn't answer directly. Instead, he sipped his coffee and nodded toward the counter. The soldier stepped forward slowly, boots heavy on the floor. You put your hands on my father. His tone was low, dangerous, and utterly controlled. The biker tried to laugh it off. Hey, man, it was just a joke. The soldier's face hardened. You don't lay a hand on a U.S. Army veteran, ever. Before the biker could respond, 2 MPs stepped in, firmly gripping his arms. The rest of the gang didn't resist. They just sat frozen, their eyes darting between the soldiers and the police. Within minutes, the situation shifted from tense to resolved, though the shame on the bikers' faces was clear. Walt's son turned back to him. You okay? Walt nodded. Takes more than that to knock me down. But I appreciate the enthusiasm. The diner slowly returned to its morning rhythm, though the air buzzed with the story that would be told for years to come. Outside, the convoy remained, rain glistening on steel and camouflage. And inside, an old veteran and his son shared a quiet breakfast, the bond between them stronger than ever, and the respect for Walt etched deeper into the hearts of everyone who'd witnessed it. Outside the diner, the rain had slowed to a mist, but the tension still hung heavy in the air. The scar-faced biker was being escorted out by 2 military police officers, his hands zip-tied behind his back. His friends sat frozen in the diner, staring at their plates as if they could disappear into them. The locals, who had been whispering moments earlier, now spoke openly, their voices low but edged with satisfaction. Everyone knew the bikers had crossed a line, not just a legal one, but a moral one. Walt's son, Captain Mark Jennings, stood tall in the middle of the diner, his presence a wall between the troublemakers and his father. His uniform was immaculate despite the wet weather, the fabric crisp, the boots polished to a shine. But it wasn't his clothing that commanded the room, it was the sheer authority in his eyes. Which one of you thought it was a good idea to lay hands on an 81-year-old man? Mark asked, his voice calm but carrying a weight that made even the toughest patrons uneasy. The 3 remaining bikers glanced at each other. None of them spoke. The scar-faced man outside muttered something under his breath, but his voice was drowned out by the steady patter of rain on the diner's windows. Mark stepped closer to their table. Here's what's going to happen. You're going to stay seated until the police finish taking your statements. You will cooperate fully, and when this is over, you will leave this town and never set foot in it again. Am I clear? One of the bikers, a stockier man with tattoos running down his arms, opened his mouth to argue, but the soldier standing behind Mark took a step forward, hand resting on the grip of his sidearm. The biker shut his mouth. At that moment, Officer Daniels, one of the local police, walked up to Mark. Captain Jennings, appreciate your quick response, but we've got it from here. We'll process them and make sure charges are filed. Mark gave a curt nod. Good. My father won't press charges for the sake of peace, but they'll answer for disturbing the peace and assault. The words, my father, seemed to land heavily in the room. It wasn't just that a veteran had been attacked, it was that his son, a decorated army officer, had dropped everything to be there within minutes. That kind of loyalty and readiness wasn't something people saw every day. Carol, the waitress, came over, her eyes still flashing with anger. She set a fresh cup of coffee in front of Walt. On the house, she said, you're tougher than most men half your age, but that was uncalled for. Walt smiled faintly. I've been through worse, Carol. But I'll admit, it's nice having backup. Mark pulled out the chair across from his father and sat down, his posture softening now that the immediate threat was under control. You didn't tell me what happened in detail. I got here fast because all you said was, I need you here. That's not exactly subtle. Walt sipped his coffee before replying. I didn't think I needed to explain. You've always known when it's time to act. Mark glanced toward the window where the MPs were loading the scar-faced biker into a military transport. You know, Dad, most people your age would have yelled for help or backed down. But you just sat there like you had all the time in the world. Son, Walt said with a hint of humor, when you've faced artillery fire, some loudmouth in a leather jacket doesn't exactly get your blood pressure up. The 2 shared a quiet laugh, but it was the kind of laugh that came from years of shared resilience rather than amusement. Outside, the rest of the convoy remained parked, soldiers keeping a watchful eye on the scene. A few curious townsfolk had gathered on the sidewalk, whispering about the morning's events. To them, it was already becoming a local legend, the day a group of outsiders tried to bully an old man and ended up facing the combined presence of the local police and the U.S. Army. Officer Daniels returned to the table after a few minutes. They're being taken to the county station. We'll make sure the DA gets the full report. You two can head home now. Mark stood, giving the officer a firm handshake. Thank you for handling it. As they walked toward the door, Walt put his jacket back on, the patches on the sleeves catching the light from the overhead fixtures. Mark helped him into it without saying a word, but his actions spoke volumes. When they stepped outside, the soldiers by the vehicle straightened in unison. Mark gave them a signal, and they began preparing to roll out. Before climbing into the SUV, Mark looked down at his father. You sure you're okay? I'm fine, Walt said. But I'd be lying if I said I wasn't proud of how fast you showed up. Reminded me that sometimes the cavalry really does arrive in time. Mark smiled faintly. You raised me to take care of my own. That includes you. As the convoy began moving, Walt climbed into the passenger seat of his son's SUV. They drove down Main Street in silence for a few minutes, passing familiar storefronts and waving to a few townsfolk who saluted Walt as he went by. The rain had stopped completely now, leaving the air fresh and cool. Halfway home, Mark finally spoke. You know, I'm going to be hearing about this for months from my guys. They think I'm some sort of action hero for dropping in like that. Walt chuckled. Well, don't let it go to your head. You just did what any good soldier would do for his family. Mark glanced at him with a grin. Guess it runs in the blood. When they pulled into Walt's driveway, the two men got out and stood for a moment, taking in the quiet of the neighborhood. No engines, no shouting, just the sound of wind in the trees. Walt put a hand on his son's shoulder. You ever wonder if people like that biker will ever understand respect? Mark shook his head. Some will, most won't. But that's why we keep showing them, by example, by action, by standing our ground. The two headed inside, where the smell of coffee still lingered on Walt's jacket and the morning's chaos seemed like a distant memory. But for everyone in that diner, the story would live on, not just as a tale of an old veteran who stood his ground, but of a son who came with the full weight of the army to make sure his father was never disrespected again. And somewhere in the county jail, a scar-faced biker was realizing that some people are protected not just by the law, but by an unbreakable bond that no amount of bravado could ever challenge.